So you say humans are now an indoor species, 93% of our time in either buildings or cars. But what is actually happening in the body when we live that way long term?
We have symptoms of confinement, Melissa. We develop chronic inflammation with off-gassing from not just VOCs and paints and carpet and all the stuff inside that we know about, but a lot of stuff inside we don't know about. Microplastics are in everything. And that's reflected in our CRP levels, and it's reflected in many chronic diseases, from heart disease and diabetes to brain diseases like dementia.
I'm Melissa Monti. This is Mind Love.
So we become chronically inflamed. And the other thing is, and maybe most importantly, is that our circadian rhythms are misaligned with outside. If we don't get light as a biologic signal, our bodies think that we're on all the time. And we become either wired and tired or just like bears hibernating. And that isolation and loneliness leads to more inflammation and more chronic disease, probably with the same kind of mortality and morbidity statistics that tobacco gives. About 15 cigarettes a day, loneliness counts for. So confinement has consequences, and they're medical consequences. And I think that this hasn't really been put together as a root cause of chronic illness and of the reduction in longevity that it deserves. And we lose about 5 years overall because of that chronic confinement inside and the misalignment with the natural circadian rhythm and the chronic inflammation that we've had.
It's almost ironic that we are probably the most biohacking generation that's ever existed. We've got our blue light glasses. I've got my barefoot shoes. I have changed many of my light bulbs to be the incandescent rather than the LED. But we're still also the most tired, the most anxious, the most inflamed, the most obese. Do you see these biohacking mechanisms actually working, or are we kind of kidding ourselves?
I think using biohacking mechanisms, whether you're Brian Johnson or you or me, is a really interesting thing to do. I use many of them. I have red light for my shoulder. I take the right supplements for me. I often am barefoot outside. But the problem with them is that you're leaving gains on the table, whether that's the right protein content or how much strength training you're doing or what kind of other exercise and mindfulness work you're doing. You're leaving gains on the table if your circadian rhythm is not aligned, if you're not getting adequate morning light, if you're not getting a dusk signal at sunset, if you're not getting your hands in the dirt, if you're not exercising outside, if you're not meeting people when you're outside. And those gains actually are recuperable with specific intentional activity that can actually make some of those biohacking things work better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like taking a diet pill without ever changing your eating habits.
It's like, putting your leash on your dog and saying that you walked him. It's not those things can be helpful, many of them anyway, but morning light, 10 to 15 minutes, at least 10,000 lux, even more if you can, is medicine that we are not aware of. Light is information for the brain. Air is information for the brain, just like food is information for the body and the brain. We want to think about food and do as like the most delicious guacamole you've ever had. But you also can think about the guacamole as, primarily plant fat with a little bit of fiber and a little bit of protein with great color and anti-inflammatories from the cilantro and good flavonoids from the red onion and important detoxifiers from the garlic. But at base for the body, it's also nutrition with macro and micronutrients. The same is true for nature, for light and air and water and soil, and how those elements literally influence your microbiome, your immune system, your cardiovascular system, your uh, your metabolism, and your brain function has not really been put together with chronic disease or with longevity, but it's time to do that.
I love the concept of light being a nutrient, and I've actually thought of it that way before, but it makes me wonder then, because a lot of people think maybe sitting next to a cracked window or near glass
Mhm.
counts, but it sounds like it doesn't, which might be a problem for my husband who he's going to hate me for saying this, but every now and then, I can't tell if he's joking, but he does it pretty often. He'll do the butthole sunbathing, but only indoors next to a window. Is that even working?
You know, I think we're getting to TMI. I don't know. Um,
I'm kind of a
but,
TMI person.
but what I want to say about that is that if you're looking at morning light through a window, you're missing many of the wavelengths that the sun gives you. And it doesn't really count for resetting your circadian rhythm, for improving your insulin sensitivity, for making sure you get a cortisol activation response in the morning, which is a big bump in cortisol that gives you energy for the day. And finally, for setting deep sleep for that night. Deep sleep is slow wave sleep, and you only get that marker from morning light with all of its wavelengths, which is, by the way, as you probably know, 25 to 50 times brighter outside than it is inside. Even though it feels like you have LEDs on, or in your case, incandescence or fluorescence, morning light is brighter because you have all these other wavelengths. And you don't have to look at the sun. In fact, please don't look at the sun. Look at the sky, and you don't need anything but a sky view. So you can do that from a balcony. You can do it from a doorway. You can do that from an open window that you're looking through a screen. And if you do that for 10 or 15 minutes, all of those good things happen. You get a big cortisol activation response, so you wake up and you have a surge of energy in your body. You set melatonin to be released that night so that you go to sleep well. You improve your insulin sensitivity. So you digest calories actually more efficiently in the morning than any other time, but you improve insulin sensitivity. And you set your brain for deep sleep that evening. And deep sleep, the first half of sleep or third of sleep, is, and usually the first 2 cycles of sleep, sleep cycles about 75 minutes on average, sometimes 90, is when you rebuild bone and repair muscle, not to mention clean your brain. Did you know we have a brain cleaning cycle?
I have heard of that, but my visuals are always tiny little gnomes, so I don't know how accurate it is.
Well, they have fire hoses. The gnomes have fire hoses.
I knew it.
Yeah, they do. And they rinse your brain. This is actually fascinating. It was described first in 2013. The Nobel Prize was given for it in 2017. And you have a brain cleaning cycle so that during deep sleep, your brain actually shrinks about 40%. And the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid outside of your brain, which is clear in what's in your spinal canal, that spinal fluid, rinses out the beta amyloid and tau proteins, which are associated with dementia. And you're basically sending it through the washing machine. But you don't get that unless you have deep sleep. So if you go to bed at like 10 o'clock and you get up at 6, let's say, normally, but one night you go to bed at 1:30 because you were up really late and you just couldn't, you miss most of that deep sleep. You don't just delay it, you push it away. And that means you don't clean your brain. It means that you're not repairing muscle as efficiently. It means that you're not, if you're a young woman, and especially a Caucasian young woman who's normal weight, you're not rebuilding bone and defending against osteoporosis, because that's when those things happen primarily.
That actually makes a lot of sense why the only bone I've ever broken was in my 20s when I was not going to bed any night before 2 a.m.
I don't know if I can draw a straight line from those 2 points, but I
It's
do want to
facts,
say,
John.
but women my age are very interested in preventing problems with bones, right? Osteoporosis is a big deal. And women who are 20 years older than I am are very interested. My mom is very interested in not falling and breaking a bone. And so it's not just vitamin D and calcium and medication. It's also using sleep as a tool. But to use sleep as a tool, you need morning light. You need dusk to tell your brain to continue to release melatonin that night. And dusk that works that way because the wavelengths of the light are red and amber, as opposed to morning light, where they're mostly blue. The blue wakes you up. That's what we get from screens and monitors, which is why you don't need it from 12:30 in the morning till 6 in the morning, when it's been shown to increase heart attack risk by 50%, heart failure risk by 56%, and AFib and stroke by 30%. And 40% of us go to sleep with a lamp or a TV on. So that's a habit America needs to change. You don't want that bright light at night. You do want it first thing in the morning, and you do want it as a natural light when you can get it.
Does this still work if, say, you live in a town, like maybe by the beach, where it's constantly hazy until like 2 p.m.?
It does. And the reason is that cloudy days are still 10 times brighter, sometimes more than that, than indoor light. Indoor light, and you can test this yourself with a lux meter, which measures light intensity. Photographers used to be the only ones to have them, but now you can get an app that easily tells you how bright it is inside. Inside, when it's super bright inside, it's 500 lux. Normally, it's like 1 to 200 lux. Minimum outdoors on a cloudy day, it's 5 to 10,000 lux. And it's because the wavelengths of the sun are different than what we get from LEDs, from incandescents, from anything except a bulb that's made precisely to emulate the sun. And even those usually don't capture all the wavelengths. So cloudy days are better than nothing, rather than bright days are best for all kinds of reasons. But cloudy days, you just have to stay out a little longer.
Good to know, because there's that nefarious plan to block out the sun, and at least now I know it won't work and slowly
The
killing
gnomes
us
won't
all.
be responsible for that.
There's something I'm going to be honest. I thought that your book was going to tell me a lot of things I already knew, and I actually learned a lot from it, including about the master clock, which I do know about our circadian rhythm. And I actually have learned from traditional Chinese medicine that there are different times in our sleep periods, at least they believe, that repair and regenerate different organ systems. So I know that like 1 to 3 a.m. is supposedly liver detoxification. 3 to 5 a.m. is supposedly lungs, which is where grief lives. It's really just fascinating. But in your book, you talk about how the master clock is this tiny cluster of 20,000 neurons in the brain that syncs every organ to the sun. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, isn't that a cool thing?
Yeah.
It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN. And every organ has its own clock. This is one of the leading theories of aging, by the way, that organs age at different rates. So you have a master clock that controls the timing of every organ, how it functions, and that each organ has its own clock. And if your kidneys seem to age faster than your heart, then eventually you may have kidney problems instead of heart problems. And that the way that those clocks can work together is coordinated by the SCN, and that each of them ought to or can be responsible for having its clock set by the sun. So the sun moves to the back of your eye and hits your retina, which then sends an impulse to the SCN, which then sends sync signals out to all of the other organs. And more detail is probably both beyond me at the moment and maybe not fascinating to everyone. But the point is that if you're thinking about not aging as quickly, if you want to reduce premature aging, the easiest way to do it is to sync your clock so that it syncs the clock in all the other organs. And syncing the clock starts with morning light.
If you don't get the morning light, or when's that cutoff period of okay, it's not morning, now it's 12:15. This light's not going to do anything.
You're done. Yeah. So the receptors in the retina are most sensitive for about 60 minutes you're awake.
Oh, so it's more about when we wake up rather than the actual time outside.
Right. Now, time outside is beneficial for other reasons. So morning light is just like to sync the master clock, which you were asking about. But time outside anytime is beneficial for other things. Like the primary other reason to be outside at least 120 minutes a week and optimally 300 minutes a week, specifically and intentionally, very different than just like walking the parking lot or going to pick up the newspaper or whatever else, is that specific intentional time is what helps to make you younger. It helps your telomeres to not fray as quickly. Telomeres are the end caps of chromosomes, as you know. And those are markers of aging, and every cell has them and every organ has them. And you want to reduce the fraying of telomeres and how much shorter they're getting so that you can live with greater health span. And health span is a time that you're alive, that you're healthy. Right now, we have a gap of about 10 years between the time that we die and the time that we start getting sick when we get old. On average, an American lives now, this year, to the age 79, which means around age 69, he or she the wheels start coming off. And you lose proprioception, you lose balance, you have incidents which wind you up in the hospital or that cause you to take more medicine. That big gap is really sad because that's more than 15% of life that is spent feeling sick on average. What we want to do is compress that so that if you do live to age 79, up to age 78 and a half is healthy. And that's what green exercise does for you. That's what consistent sleep does for you. Even more important than number of hours you sleep is going to bed and getting up at the same time, because it's been shown that that's what preserves telomere length. Consistency of sleep is more important for longevity than hours of sleep. This is a study done on 61,000 people followed for 8 years in the UK, published just a couple of years ago in a prominent medical journal, showing that consistency of sleep, again governed by your master clock, is more important than hours of sleep for longevity. And green exercise outside, is part of how you get there, because it enables you to use every part of your body, because you're using your senses when you're outside rather than your lists and your adrenergic nervous system, because you have to balance when you're on a trail instead of walk flat when you're on a treadmill. You are noticing things around you and meeting people often when you're outside. And that's good. That kind of social connection is healthy and not just reduces loneliness, but reduces inflammation and CRP levels. Just like being near or close to greenery lowers CRP levels by 22% in some of the largest studies. So green exercise anytime, but especially 30 minutes, 3 times a week, lowers cortisol levels, your stress hormone levels, by 21% over their normal diurnal variation, over what it would normally go down during the day. So each of these things are additive for reducing inflammation, for improving longevity, and improving health span, which is what we really care about.
So, what I'm hearing is that the way we're engaging with outside actually matters. There's a difference between really being in it, utilizing outside, like being a part of nature versus just setting up your anti-gravity chair while scrolling Instagram outside.
I would say that that counts only a tiny bit. That it's not very, it is intentional, you get that, but it's not using any of your senses. The way that we experience nature is through our senses. And if your phone is in your hand, your brain thinks you're still working. And that's not the right idea for engaging outside as a therapeutic and preventative tool. What is the right idea is using your senses, and either deliberately or subliminally. And your senses, as you know, are touch, hear, see, smell, and taste. And those five, all on your face, are how you experience the wind, leaves, fractal patterns, aromatherapy, phytoncides, which are chemicals that trees emit to communicate to one another that have beneficial effects on immunity in people. And taste, although you should only taste absolutely what you know, and not
Don't
what you
tempt
don't
me with
know.
a good time.
Yeah. I have two words for you, death cap. So I don't eat any mushrooms outside ever. And I have a farm. I just don't trust it. And I used to gather morels for the restaurant I worked in. And I guess I was just lucky.
I know. I'm a different girl now than I was 15 years ago when I'd usually ask what I just swallowed after they'd give it to me. But now we're in the motherhood phase, so not quite the problem.
I think that's wiser. I don't have any other word for that except wiser.
This reminds me of something you talk about, though, which I love the name of digital obesity. The idea that we're consuming more data than our nervous systems can even metabolize.
Yeah, that's good.
But I most often hear about information overload more as a productivity problem.
Yeah.
What hit you to see it as a biological problem?
I practiced internal medicine for 30 years. And I think the most undervalued health data point that doctors generally don't ask about, because we generally don't have time and haven't been taught to value it, is where people spend their time. And especially during COVID, when it became normal to have a screen-centered life, I noticed that so many of my patients were wired and tired. They were inside all the time. They were frustrated, and they just couldn't go outside because they were scared and didn't have the right kind of information about the virus. And kids also, I noticed that kids had free COVID books and Chromebooks rather, and it struck me that their existences had changed so that they were much more lonely, much more inward looking, much more self-identifying without being able to be out in the world. And as I looked at people my patients especially, who had suffered this big tragedy along with everybody else, it struck me that it was their environment that had changed the most. And that's why I began to think about it in biologic terms. And then there's the second thing, which is that I'm lucky enough to live on a farm. I actually work on the farm. It's a working organic regenerative farm. And I took the opposite check. I was outside like all the time because I thought outside was safe. And 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 I began inviting people over on tours generally to walk around and you could just see how their shoulders relaxed. And they talked immediately about how it's a place of solace and comfort. And it was still, an abandoned nursery that was trying to be transformed, but it was nevertheless quiet and green. And it showed me that they were not just escaping an indoor epidemic, that they were beginning to heal. And that's why I wrote this, because I thought that people needed a way to begin to use nature as we used to know it, as a therapeutic tool, as a ordinary part of life, as a way to experience life. So we're not just, part of nature. We are actually using it in a way that makes us healthy again. And I mean that in a medical sense. I think it's been undervalued and kind of missed in mainstream medicine, that environment determines health. And we think about burnout as a personal failing. It's not that at all. It's a being inside and on a device all the time is kind of a biological adaptation to that confined place. And it's really an environmental failure. We're medicalizing what's really an environmental deficiency. We need to be engaged with nature. We need to have green exercise. We can forest bathe. We ought to garden. 70 million of us think we're gardeners. And that's important, not just for the notion and act of nurturing something, which is cool, to grow something yourself that you then eat or admire or give, but also because the soil if it's healthy soil, improves your microbiome, which you need for digestion and need for defense on your skin against other organisms. So it began to make sense after a while that we had missed this, but that I was seeing it restored, seeing people restored because they were experiencing it in front of my own eyes.
Do you think we missed it, or do you think we ignored it because we can't capitalize on it as much? I've seen images of hospitals from 100 years ago that had like a sun deck for healing, and they were all in linen clothes and sheets, and now we're all in polyester with bright lights inside.
Yeah.
And I'm almost worried about the word getting out too much, because then there's just going to be more admission fees for the forest.
You get to my age and you can buy a lifetime pass. I think the good news there is that nature is not the Grand Canyon or the Pacific Ocean. It's your backyard. It's the park down the street. And if you don't have a backyard and there isn't a park down the street, you might have a houseplant. You might have a dog at your feet. You might have even wind that rustles your curtains. You might have lettuce in your salad. All of these are connections to how things grow, and something bigger than yourself, and something that makes sense outside of your phone. Just like sugar burns out your metabolism, too many pixels burn out your brain, and you can't metabolize it, and then you do become digitally obese and burned out for that reason. But that burnout is not personal. It's because your environment is wrong, because you're inside with the phone, the monitor, the screen, the lights, too much. And if you change your environment, that digital obesity actually goes away. It's a lot cheaper than GLP-1.
Yeah, on your bones too.
There you go.
You mentioned forest bathing. And I love this because my backyard is the forest. I literally live backed up to the national forest. I hold sound baths there. But walk us through what's actually happening in the body when we're in the forest, rather than just relaxing, but biologically.
So forest bathing was described, as you probably know, in 1982, I believe, by Dr. King Lee, L.I., in Tokyo at Nippon Medical School. And he's a general physician, taught at the school, and he did a series of studies, and which have been reproduced since, which showed that when you take men and women and you go into a forested area, and he went into forests of Japanese cypress, which emit specific phytochemicals or phytoncides, which are used for trees to communicate to one another, and also to warn trees against predators like other bugs, and are often aromatic. So we sometimes use them in aromatherapy, and connected the idea that those phytoncides had a demonstrated improvement on the immune system, and especially the production of natural killer cells, which are kinds of white blood cells that your body normally makes that to fight infection and to kill off cancer cells before they become a tumor. And he found that this kind of effect lasted for up to a week, and in some cases a month, in both women and in men, and began integrating it into not just his practice, but into medical schools. And now there are forest bathing centers all over Japan and in Korea that are part of their national health systems. Much of Asia and other parts of the world are way ahead of us in nature-based medicine. The UK, especially in horticulture and gardening, care farming in the Netherlands, and many other modalities all over the world, Australia and New Zealand. But forest bathing in particular has been adopted in America by botanic gardens, by some hospital systems. And to do this in your own backyard, you can use a guide who can lead you through a traditional way of being and listening and identifying sounds and textures. Or you can begin to do it yourself in a very simple way, like I described earlier, where you use your senses, all 5 of your senses that I described: touch, hear, see, smell, taste. And you do that for a minute. So I like starting with hearing in forests or under tree canopy because it's the most immediately rewarding. You listen for 30 seconds to every sound you can. And at the end of the 30 seconds, you listen for another 30 seconds and you try to identify 2 other sounds you haven't heard. And you think, well, I heard everything. What's up? But in fact, your ears begin to adjust and your brain begins to adjust to other input. And so what this does, and you continue to do this with things that you touch and things that you see at a distance and things that you smell to try to identify additional ones. What you learn is that your senses are active in ways that you didn't know. And it uses a different part of your brain to kick in your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest nervous system, instead of your always on adrenergic, I'm looking at my phone, I'm looking at notifications, I have lists, your fight or flight system. And in doing this, you reset your alarm system, and your body gives you basically safety signals that it's okay for your senses to work and that they got you. Instead of your alarm system, which is how your phone treats you, where everything is really important because it just popped up or it just buzzed or just you heard it. So forest bathing, I like it with a guide. When we taught UCLA physicians the first nature-based medicine skills course, we taught how to forest bathe. I had a forest bathing guide come to the farm and she taught people and they all loved it because it's totally relaxing, but it's like active relaxation. So it's not exercise. You're not going 2 miles in 30 minutes. You're going a quarter mile or an eighth of a mile in 30 minutes. And you're using your senses to identify what around you is fascinating. And nature takes care of that through something called soft fascination, which is how your attention is drawn instead of demanded. And that's how nature works for you as a visual or auditory sense. You feel pulled towards it and you are curious about it and you investigate it rather than, oh, I got to do this. Oh, I got to do that. Oh, this has to happen, which is how we normally go through life. But this has dramatic effects, not just on the immune system, but also on your systemic inflammation. Being in greenery or near greenery can lower C-reactive protein by 22% within just a few minutes. And C-reactive protein is a general marker for how inflamed your body is and connected to many chronic diseases that I've covered: diabetes and heart disease, dementia, arthritis, intestinal problems. So forest bathing is a win, and it deserves to be tried for everybody. It's easy, fun, very inexpensive if you use a guide, and free if you do it yourself.
I'm reminded how when I first met my husband, we were both in our late 20s, but I was just a party girl at that time. The life that I had already lived, like the things that I had already done, I still recounting my stories from my 20s. People are like, how is that all in one life? And when we would drive up the mountain, because I met him in Big Bear before, when we lived here for a little over a year. I got him to move off, and then we moved back in 2020. But we would be driving up or down the mountain, and he'd always stop and gaze, and he would take in the sights. And I was falling in love, so I'd go with it. But there was a part of me that was like, okay, let's go. I was always on to the next thing.
Sure.
And over time, I learned that his mom really instilled that in him, like always telling him to appreciate nature. And he grew up in the middle of the woods and all of that. Mm-hmm. And I lived in the suburbs, and I just didn't appreciate it that much. And it's kind of like when I've done my dopamine detoxes, when I'm like, okay, I'm on my phone too much. Let me really watch my screen time. I can feel a difference after just one day of treating my phone differently, like actually detaching from it. And those two things combined, people don't realize that so often. If they're like, well, watching the sunset just doesn't stimulate me. Yeah, now in your current state, get there, like make it a goal. Detach from all of the things that are too exciting so that you can appreciate this. It's not like you're just not that kind of person. You're not allowing yourself to see what kind of person you can be.
There's a lot of difference between spike and crash dopamine and green dopamine. So spike and crash dopamine is self-descriptive. Green dopamine is much more steady and much more rewarding. When you're in your 20s, sometimes you can handle that. You're kind of used to spikes. You alluded to a wild 20s, and you have such great energy. Almost nothing can get in your way. You pull all-nighters, you stay up late, you get up early, and it all seems okay because you go, go, go. You get past that, and you find that although you still have great energy, you want to be able to parcel it out so that it delivers better returns. And that's what your husband was doing when he was stopping and admiring. He was getting the kind of input that he needed to calm his brain, to focus, to conduct the rest of the day. Kids who look out the window in school are often disciplined because they're not paying attention in school. But that's wrong. Those kids actually are trying to reset their brain because they're in the wrong environment to learn. So they need to have the distance that that window can provide. And speaking of windows, the most famous study in any of this is patients who are on one side of an aisle of a hallway in a hospital who looked out a window and saw greenery and had a gallbladder operation, used to have to be in the hospital for gallbladder operation. And other patients had the same operation on the other side of the hallway over 3 years, saw a brick wall. The people had a green view, had half the pain medication, needed half the pain medication, mostly opiates. They stayed in the hospital nearly a day less. And the nurses thought that their hospital stay was better. So And that's changed hospital architecture. That study by Roger Ulrich was published in 1984, been studied over 5,000 times in Science magazine. Your brain is trying to do the same thing when you stop and admire beauty. It's resetting itself to allow you to have energy to go on. And I would honor that, because it's a powerful tool that you want to take advantage to natively. And yet I understand, Melissa, this feeling of get up and go. I've had that a lot in my life. I like feeling get up and go. I like having a lot of energy, but you find that you actually have more energy, and you're not just covering exhaustion with caffeine, which is what you do in the morning for many of us. You're actually developing it in your body yourself. You're feeding it with green exercise that's specific, and games like pickleball and sports like skiing and even walking are powerful tools. In fact, walking decreases all-cause mortality by 19%, better than any other activity. And the one activity that reduces death from respiratory disease better than any other physical activity is heavy chopping and digging, serious gardening. This from a study of over 111,000 people over 34 years from Harvard researchers, published just a month ago. And it shows that you need both. You need both the gym to be strong, to have exercise that's disciplined and specific, and you need outdoor exercise like walking, a variety of exercise to improve longevity and to decrease mortality. And I start for almost everyone, who's especially people not used to exercise, with simple walking, but it is always walking outside, because you use so many other senses, because you improve balance and proprioception, because you notice things and your brain is reset, and not with your phone on, and especially not looking at your phone because you trip.
I think that's been my favorite thing about getting older, is just having an actual appreciation for physical activity that doesn't just like slay me. Like when I was younger, it's like, that wasn't a hard enough workout. Like I'm not sweating enough. I don't feel like I'm going to pass out. And now I'm like, what a lovely light stroll I had to the mailbox.
I love that too. I also like getting stronger in the gym. That resistance training is probably the most powerful type of exercise for metabolism. And we all need that. But you have to complement it with outdoor exercise. My favorites are gardening, walking, and pickleball. But I'm open to golf. I can still play tennis. It's really powerful. And if I lived where you do, I would ski, if the opportunity was afforded me. So what I've learned with this is that it's not only a stroll in the park, although a park is some of the best place to get this. It's actually a medical tool where you're defeating the indoor forces that are trying to burn you out, because often people are not burned out. They're just inside too much, and they're not broken. Their environment is broken. And if we fix that, then all of a sudden we have gains not left on the table, not all those biohacks that we're so keen on providing ourselves. This is actually a productivity tool. The people I find who are most seriously interested in this stuff are CEOs, because they realize that their workforce is not being as productive as it can be, because they're not getting the kind of environmental stimulus that they need, which is actually not often directly in the office. So this is a tool, and you're right, it's not that easy to monetize, which is maybe why it hasn't been surfaced like the latest gene
Blue light
manipulation.
glasses.
Yeah. But there are clever ways to do that if you want to. And there are very inexpensive ways. The hundreds of things I list in Indoor Epidemic, 98% of them are free. Maybe not quite that high, but 90. And there are, that's a good thing. We want people to get healthy, and we want to not overcharge them for it.
Have you heard of Dr. John Leaf? He wrote a book called The Secret Language of Cells.
I have not.
Well, he has this idea that cells are essentially communicating at every level of nature. He was on the podcast like years and years ago, back in like, I think exclusive episode 58 or 59. But it's not just our cells talking to cells inside of our bodies, but that the whole biological world is basically in constant conversation. And one of the examples he used is that when you just gaze at a tree, it actually stimulates your cells to regenerate. And so when I was reading your book about phytoncides, am I pronouncing that right?
You are.
Okay, good. That's what it felt like to me. Like the trees aren't just passively emitting compounds and our bodies happen to benefit, but we're actually in dialogue with the forest that's been going on for millions of years. Does
That's
that
a lovely way
framing
to think
resonate?
about it. It's a lovely way to think about it. I don't know the science behind that, but I know that trees do communicate through their roots and share resources through their roots. I thought you were going to ask me about The Secret Life of Trees by Peter W. Or what's her name, scientist with the last begins with an S, who did a terrific TED talk about how trees communicate. And there's a lot of data for that. It sounds a little woo, but it's not. How to use that information for personal medical health is not as clear. But it is clear that there are bacteria in the soil that make serotonin. And that's one reason that you should have your hands in the soil. The most prominently known is called Mycobacterium vacci. So it's a mycobacterium, it's not an actual bacterium. And that production of serotonin gets on your skin and in your lungs, just like the healthy microbes in the soil help to improve the microbiome in your lungs, where you have one as well. So I feel like there's a lot to learn about this and a lot we don't know. But what I found in researching this book, and I read 2,200 studies to complement this observational work I've had in clinical practice and to put the book together, is that outdoors is a tool that can provide much of the stimulus we need so that, light first, caffeine second, your morning wakes you up, and your sleep provides not just consistency, but brain cleaning and muscle rebuilding and insulin sensitivity. And those things together can begin to correct, I think, the health span problem we have, can improve longevity, and can fight a lot of the chronic inflammation that we have as a people, because we've never been confined this much as a people. And we can change that by aligning with nature and being really deliberate about the specific intentional time that we're outside as a preventive and therapeutic tool.
Yeah, when you said in your book that kids today spend less time outdoors than prisoners in maximum security facilities, I thought I was going to throw up.
I know.
But
and teens have, antidepressants are up 70% in teens. But children especially kids with ADHD, especially kids with behavior problems, if you can get them in a park, it changes their neurobiology. And that's what we're trying to do.
And I think so often people hear all this stuff and it's like, well, what do I actually do? Like, I try to limit screen time, but I need to use it sometimes. I work, all this stuff. But you propose that the solution is really just optimizing that 7% of our time outdoors, and that can reverse a lot of damage. What does that look like on the worst, busiest day for someone who genuinely can't get outside for long?
I do think that's important to say, that the minimum effective dose is 2 hours a week, and that we are spending already almost 12 hours a week. So you just have to repurpose the time that you're already spending, just make it intentional. So what does that look like? It means if you can get morning light 10 to 15 minutes, 7 days a week, you're already at 100 minutes, and you only need 120 minimum. But if you miss morning light a couple of times, if you have any time of green exercise, even any type of outdoor exercise in a place of choice, That's what the data show, that you want to reduce your cortisol level. So it can't be somewhere you're dragged and you don't want to go, or like an indoor climbing wall doesn't count. You want to be able to go to a lake with beautiful water, or a trail with all greenery, or a park down the street. It doesn't have to be a forest, because what you need is a sky view, not a forest. You need a sky view. And you can take little breaks in your day to add up to that minimum 120 minutes. If you get up from your chair once an hour, you go to a doorway or a window that has a screen, and you look at the furthest point you can see for a minute, the muscles outside of your eyes, the ciliary muscles, which cause your eyes to focus in their sockets, relax, because you're not doing this, where you're like focused here. I could just feel my eye muscles go like this. But if you take that away and you look at a distance, I'm looking at a window beyond the computer, they now relax. And if you do that for a full minute, you're not preventing myopia, because that takes 5 minutes an hour, or improving myopia. You are allowing your muscles to relax so that you don't get the headache and fatigue that are associated with near work, which is why in Singapore and many South Asian countries, myopia is 90% for kids. And myopia itself is not terrible. It's nearsightedness, as you know. You wear glasses, you get eye drops. But about 5% of myopia results in near blindness, and in your 30s or 40s. And that's something we want to prevent. And you can do that by 5 minutes an hour looking at a distance. To just relax to get that 120 minutes, do it a minute an hour. And you need that break anyway to get up from your chair so that you're not sedentary. And then the third thing you want to do to get to that 120 minutes, if you're doing morning light, if you're doing some green exercise, gardening, walking, pickleball, the dog, skiing, jogging, swimming in an outdoor pool when that's possible, or a lake or in the ocean when that's possible, and it isn't always, then you want to be able to look at dusk. You want to have the dusk light, the red and amber waves of the sun, tell your brain that it'll be okay to release melatonin that night. So you get a twofer. You get to go to sleep that night on time, if you don't have bright light within 60 minutes of bedtime optimally, because that suppresses your melatonin by 80%. So you want to make sure that that lamp isn't on, or that monitor isn't on. And it tells your brain to begin to cool down your body, because that's what happens when you go to sleep. Your body physically cools down, and you actually needs to cool down 2 or 3 degrees in order for you to sleep well, which is why cool, dark rooms are often recommended for optimal sleep. So these 3 things kind of are minimum effective therapies themselves. But there are hundreds more, literally, in the book, ways to do these things. And you might be saying, well, my morning's already planned out. I got everything down to the minute, so I can get out the door, or I can get my husband out the door, or I can get my kids out the door. Everything's already booked. I don't have 10 or 15 minutes to go outside, and it's cold anyway. What do I do? The answer is you do little microdoses. Why your coffee is in the microwave, you go to an open window. Why the toaster is down and toasting, you go to an open window or a doorway. Why anything in the kitchen, the kettle is heating, you go to an open door and you give yourself 30 seconds. Some is better than none. If you're parking somewhere, if you get up early, you park somewhere it's dark, and then you go somewhere, you're catching a train, you're trying to get somewhere, you give yourself kind of a parking lot dose. You park at the very end of the parking lot, and you make the walk intentional. You're not looking at your phone the whole way. You're trying to feel the morning light. You're trying to look at the sun. You don't have your phone in your hand because your brain thinks you're working and not absorbing nature. And you're using both microdoses that way and your surroundings in ways that are healthy. So you you use what you have. I know not everybody can take that much time, but it actually gives you back more if you can.
Well, I always love leaving listeners with a challenge of the week, and that sounds like the perfect one. We outlined them pretty well. For listeners who want a refresher of that, join the Mind Love Collective. You can go to mindlove.com/join, where I outline all of these little tips that the guests leave. But for listeners that want the other 97 tips from your book, where's the best place for them to connect?
IndoorEpidemic.com. We have freebies there, actually. Lots of curated free resources for people to take advantage of. And there's priority access to the book before it's released as well, so that we can begin to build this community of people who are curious about how they can use nature as medicine and not be as reliant on the medicine that they need to take, but instead take their health into their own hands and do it in a way that's actually really fun and beautiful.
Want to work through this week's Mind Love Challenge with others? The Mind Love Collective is a free community with monthly themed calls, weekly challenge accountability, and real support throughout the year. So join us at mindlove.com/join. Thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.